Hello, my name is William K. Wesley, and welcome to Tax Watchers, a program that introduces you to all aspects of taxation and legislation that affects you, the viewer. Today, we'll discuss the November 16th propositions, all of them in 30 minutes. And who better to do that than Mac Taylor, head of the Legislative Analyst office in Sacramento. Mac, I understand your office provides all the analyses we see in our voter information guides. I also understand your office is nonpartisan and provides fiscal and program analyses to the state legislature and the state budget on all policy areas. So welcome and thank you for being with us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, William.
I'm glad to have you. Well, we might as well get started. We have a lot of them. Before this program, we discussed grouping the propositions into subjects and discussing those together. So let's get started. We're going to address the tax issues, then look at the law enforcement ones. From there, we'll go to the social issues and wrap up with the least controversial issues or general government propositions. Sound like a plan?
Sounds good.
All righty. So first, the tax issues. Let's talk about Proposition 51, which authorizes the state to sell $9 billion in bonds for community college and K through 12. I thought school facilities were paid for by local bonds.
Well, that is a key funding source, but over the past few decades, most school facilities have been funded with a combination of state general obligation bonds, like this one that's in Proposition 51, and then the locals tend to match the funds because the state requires a dollar for dollar match, generally speaking. So they use their local bond issues to provide that match. So basically it's a jointly funded program.
So without these bonds, we won't have the state matching portion?
Well, the locals would have to pay more on their own, so they could support fewer facilities than otherwise.
Got it. Thank you. Next, Proposition 52. This is an interesting one. This is a tax that was imposed on private hospitals in 2009 by the state legislature. Now, this measure proposes to make it a permanent assessment. What can you tell us about this one?
Well, this is a little bit of a difficult one, but basically you're right. There's a charge imposed on private hospitals, about $4.5 billion a year. The state collects that. It takes a little bit of a piece of it to help with its own state budget. The rest of the money is used for additional Medi-Cal payments. I want to spend just a second on Medi-Cal because it's going to pop up in our next two propositions.
Okay.
Medi-Cal is a very large state program that provides healthcare services to low-income people. So basically by having this charge, the state is able to maximize federal payments coming into the state. And that's the basic reason why we do it. It allows us to both get a little bit of benefit to the state general fund while basically taking advantage of these federal matching dollars. The legislature has extended that tax several times. This would just ensure that the tax continued on as long as the federal government allowed it.
Okay, so essentially not a change, a continuation.
Exactly.
Okay. Now to Proposition 55, which is a tax increase on high-income taxpayers, which was scheduled to end in 2018. What's that one on? But before I ask you what that's about, what's the state's definition of high income in this context?
Well, for this measure, if you were a single filer, you were not married, it would be if you had income over $250,000 roughly.
Okay.
If you were filing a married couple filing a joint return, you'd have to have over about $500,000 before these additional personal income tax rates kicked in.
Got it.
People may remember back in 2012, we passed Proposition 30, and that imposed these higher income tax rates. So what this measure would do would be, instead of them ending in 2018, as you mentioned, they would go on for another 12 years. It also adds one other provision related to that Medi-Cal program we talked about. It provides a mechanism where some of the additional monies that's raised by the measure could go to the Medi-Cal program. It depends on a rather complex calculation that the executive branch would have to do, but it is one other provision of that measure.
All right, thank you. So Proposition 56, another tax measure. This one adds $2 per pack to cigarettes to be used to fund health care, tobacco use prevention, and law enforcement. And currently the cigarette tax is 87 cents per pack.
Yes.
Tell us about this one.
Well, that's a nice summary actually that you gave. This would more than triple the tax on cigarettes. We also levy a tax on other tobacco products, chewing tobacco, things like that, cigars, etc. So it would not only almost triple or more than triple the tax, it would also tax for the first time e-cigarettes, which was sort of a big issue that the legislature has been dealing with. The measure would raise about $1 billion to $1.5 billion, depending on how smokers respond to those higher taxes. And as you said, most of the money would go to the state's Medi-Cal program.
Okay. Okay, I guess it's time to move on to law and order items on the ballot. First, Proposition 57, dealing with criminal and juvenile sentencing, which proposes more early release for sentenced individuals and changes some of the procedures for juveniles. Now, I think I read in your analysis that this could lead to 30,000 current prisoners being eligible for parole. But before you answer that piece, would you tell us about who would be eligible? Like, are these violent, non-violent, a combination of both?
They're only for non-violent people in state prison.
Okay.
So it would not be anything against personal crimes like murder or rape or serious assault, things like that. So the measure actually does three things. Your question starts with one aspect of it, earlier parole consideration. Right now, these nonviolent people under federal court orders are allowed to be released on parole, but this measure might allow them to be released a little bit earlier. In addition, it gives the administration, the executive branch, the people who run the state prisons, much greater authority to give good time off for credits for good time off, good behavior. Currently, people in prison can get this, but this would in effect give the administration more latitude to grant that sort of good time behavior, those credits. And finally, you also mentioned it affects juvenile justice.
Right.
And very simply, when you have kids who are age 14 to 17 who commit rather serious crimes, they can sometimes be tried in an adult court as opposed into juvenile court.
Exactly.
They're very different processes.
Right.
And so this measure would make it a little bit more difficult to be tried in adult court.
Thank you. Another one of those law and order issues is Proposition 63, which relates to the selling and purchasing of ammunition. Now, this is sure to be controversial, so walk us through that one.
Well, and it's even a little more complicated because between the time that this measure, this initiative measure was circulating to be put on the ballot, and now, the legislature took action to cover many of the same areas regarding ammunition sales as are covered in the measure. So now I would say one of the most important things that this Proposition 63 does is it sets up a new court process for the removal of firearms from someone who has been convicted of a felony. That is, once you commit a felony, you're a prohibited person. That is, you can't own firearms.
Right.
But if a person who has never been convicted of a felon has a firearm and they're newly convicted, they have the right to have that firearm. Once they're convicted, they needed a process to try to get those firearms out of that household.
Got it.
So it sets up a new process to try to do that.
Okay. Now, here again is one of the more controversial measures. This is Proposition 64, which legalizes marijuana in the state.
Yes, as most people know, it's currently legal for medical purposes. And this would, as you say, expand it for any purpose, not medical or non-medical, or some people refer to the non-medical as recreational.
Right, right.
So it also imposes taxes on the growers. So this could be done now. You'd have to apply and be licensed, and you would tax it both at the growing stage and at the retail stage. So there would be significant taxes placed on the purchase of marijuana. That would raise a lot of money. We don't know exactly how much. It could be hundreds of millions to in excess of $1 billion over time, depending on how fast and how big the market becomes in the state.
Right.
That money would be dedicated for specific purposes such as substance abuse programs and drug education and various things like that.
Thank you. There are also two measures on the ballot having to deal with the death penalty. Proposition 62 prohibits the penalty in all cases, and 66 changes the procedures but does not abolish the death penalty. We could probably use a little bit of background on these two and how they came to be, having just literally conflicting measures on the same ballot.
No, I think that's exactly right. Well, just a little bit of background. We currently have the death penalty for first-degree murder if there are special circumstances. Multiple deaths, multiple murders, if it's murder for hire, things like that. It's not just for a single killing of an individual. It has to meet these special circumstances. There are extensive appeals process, both state and federal courts, that makes it, there's a very long period of time between when someone is sentenced until the time they may be executed. It can easily be in excess of 20 years. So now you have two measures that take a different view. One, for whatever reasons, they don't believe ethically, philosophically that we should have a death penalty.
Right.
They would want to vote for Proposition 62 that just repeals the death penalty for first-degree murder. The other view takes the view that the death penalty is a reasonable penalty, but we want to make it go, we want it faster. We want to have a faster resolution of these cases, that it shouldn't take 20, 25 years to go through that. So it introduces what they're trying to do is reform it and speed up, accelerate the process from the time of the sentence to the actual execution of that sentence.
And what happens if both pass?
Well, that's a good question. If they both pass, it depends on which one gets the most aye votes, the yes votes. If 66, the one that would try to speed up the process, gets the most votes, it has language that apparently would make the 62 repeal null and void. It would not take effect. If 62 gets more votes, you could practically say there's not a death penalty unless the legislature later on were to enact it for a different purpose, say for treason or something like that. And then you would have this speeded up process just for that new penalty.
Got it. Thank you. Now let's look at social issues, specifically Proposition 58, which does away with the current requirement that public schools teach most English learners in English-only programs. What does that mean?
Well, that was a requirement that was put on the books back in 1998 when the people approved Proposition 227. It basically ended most bilingual programs, and it said, as you suggested, that they wanted kids in these so-called immersion programs. This measure, put on the ballot by the legislature, in effect would reverse that proposition, and it would allow school districts to decide whether they wanted to have those English immersion programs, bilingual programs. They basically could make that decision.
Okay. So how would that change our schools? It makes them individually responsible per district?
And there's some, parents could still ask for an English immersion program and they would have to provide it. And parents could have inputs on the type of bilingual programs, but it does put most of the onus on the individual school district.
Got it, thank you. Staying with social issues, Proposition 60 has to do with health requirements for adult filmmakers in California. What's that one about?
Well, as you said, if the adult film industry, the porn industry as it's commonly referred to, this would increase the regulation of that industry. It would require film producers to be licensed and to follow various requirements. It clarifies that condoms have to be used on film sets, although that's generally the way it's enforced now by the state. And it allows Californians, any Californian, under certain circumstances from suing the producers of those adult films if they're not following these regulations.
Okay. Proposition 61 is pretty interesting. If it passes, the state would be prohibited from paying more for any prescription drug than the lowest price paid by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs for the same thing. How would that work?
Well, that's a good question. We're not sure exactly how it would work, but it's very clear what they're trying to do. They're trying to get the state, when we purchase drugs for our Medi-Cal program again, or for our state employees, to get the lowest possible price on drugs. And it's generally understood that the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Federal Department of Veteran Affairs, gets probably the best prices. You should think of it as sort of like that the manufacturer suggested retail price on a car.
Right.
That's the maximum.
Right.
And
so they get it wholesale.
The bigger you get, the more the discounts you can.
Right, right.
And the question is, we don't always know what the VA pays for those drug prices. In addition, it only requires the state that they cannot pay more than that. It doesn't necessarily change the drug manufacturer's practices. They could simply, in some cases, raise their prices, for example, that they charge the VA. So it was very hard to do an estimate of actually what the impact will be of the measure.
Got it. Okay, let's go to Propositions 65 and 67. They both deal with carry-out bags for retail customers. What would they do, and what happens if they both pass?
Okay. It gets a little confusing here, too, with the two of them. The legislature passed a law in 2014 that said nowhere in the state could you sell single-use plastic bags, those little flimsy ones that people are concerned about. In addition, you had to charge at least 10 cents for any other types of bags, say a paper bag. The stores were allowed to keep the money of that under that law. Before that law could go into effect, the voters, Californians, used what's called the referendum process to say, wait a minute, we want the people to vote on that. So they collected a bunch of signatures, they got it on the ballot, and that's what Proposition 65. It's saying, do you want that law that the legislature passed to go into effect? A yes vote means yes, we agree with the law. A no vote, no, we don't. So this is a referendum on what the legislature passed.
Right.
Now, Proposition 67 was an initiative that came along and says, well, if you do have a law like Proposition 65 that's in effect, instead of the money staying with the stores, we want to take that money and put it in a state fund for various environmental purposes. That's the only thing that initiative does.
Got it, thank you.
But you did say, what if they both pass?
Exactly.
If Proposition 65, the referendum, passes and gets more votes, 67 would have no effect. If 67 gets more votes, we're not sure exactly how, but we think just the money that's collected would go into the environmental fund. It does have a provision that could call into question of whether 65, the law, the referendum, would it go into effect at all, though? So it could involve some legal suits to clarify that issue.
Interesting. Okay, 3 measures seem to come under the category of general government. These are 53, dealing with state revenue bonds, 54, requiring the posting of bills on the internet 72 hours before being considered by the legislature, and Proposition 59, having to do with campaign finance. Since we're running close to out of time, would you briefly summarize those 3 for us?
Very quickly, state revenue bonds. Normally a revenue bond does not have to be voted on by the people. This would be used for a project like a bridge where the tolls are used to pay any of the bonds that might have been issued to build the bridge. This measure says any revenue bond over $2 billion for a project has to be voted on by the people, a statewide revenue bond.
Aren't most over $2 billion?
No, most are not.
Okay.
It would only involve very, very large
big
projects.
Okay.
Say like a high-speed rail or a big water project or a huge bridge. So there can be some that would be affected.
Okay.
On Proposition 54, you hit one of the key points that a bill, before it could be passed by either house of the legislature, would have to be publicly available, any changes, for 3 days, 72 hours more specifically, before it could be voted on.
Right.
Just to give people time to respond and give their input to legislatures. It does one other thing, though. It requires that all legislative public meetings be taped, recorded, and made available on the internet for anybody to watch. And finally, very quickly, because 59 is only an advisory measure, it has no direct impact. It just, in effect, asks Californians if they want their elected officials to use their authority to try to get the so-called Citizens United Supreme Court decision, U.S. Supreme Court decision change, which dealt with, as you says, campaign spending by corporations and unions.
Got it. Wonderful job. Thank you for being my guest today, Matt. We really are glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Those were complex subjects, and you did a great job helping our viewers understand them. This was a half-hour jam-packed with lots of information. So if folks out there want to know more, they can visit the Secretary of State's website. That's www.sos.ca.gov, and read the full analyses and arguments on both sides. So again, thank you, Matt. And to my audience out there, I hope you enjoyed this production of The Tax Watchers. Until next time, this is William K. Wesley, hoping you be well, live smart, have fun.